Hello there, and welcome to this Med School Tutors webinar. You can't see my hair. There's my hair. This is creating and optimizing your UWorld Journal. My name is Dave Del Negro, and I am a senior resident in emergency medicine, hailing from the state of Pennsylvania, originally from the greatest state, New Jersey, with my friend who's hanging out there now. Rashawn, introduce yourself.
How's it going, guys? My name's Roshan. I'm and also I guess I'm officially on the senior resident side of things, and I'm in ophthalmology, and hopefully we can help you today kind of optimizing, creating everything kind of that revolves around maximizing UWorld.
Let's do it. First, a little bit about who we are at Med School Tutors. We've been doing this for 15 years. I think I'm going on my 4th year with the company. It's a lot of fun, and a lot of us we sat in the same seats you did. My God, I remember step 1 and step 2 and all that stuff. We do everything from pre-med through residency and board exams. If you have a problem, you can bring it to us, and we can see if we can help you. That's what we are, a collection of people who just like solving problems and hanging out. So what are we going to do tonight?
So I think we have a big a big list of things that we want to cover, but I really think we're going to be able to do it. We're going to briefly go over just the general things that everybody who's probably been successful with their step 1 prep has probably done. Everyone has their different way of doing things, but there are definitely some tried and true practices. We're going to also discuss, and this is going to be the major topic of our talk, what a UWorld Journal really is, how to utilize it, and how to make sure you're getting the most out of it. A couple things on organization and making sure that you're organized with your schedule, making sure you're organized with your UWorld Journal. A couple things that we've kind of want you to watch out for, and overall just helping you. If you're going to be taking the time for you to have like a 3-digit score or getting a passing result, either way, how we can help you maximize your preparation for that.
And then we'll answer some questions.
Oh, and of course, the questions.
So just to jump, head first into it. Your primary resources, some of the most commonly used resources, First Aid and UWorld. And not to spoil it, but when there's primary resources, there are secondary resources. And most study plans use a combination of these primary resources with a smattering of these secondary resources. So what we're going to talk about first before we sort of dig deep into the UWorld Journal itself is, how do we use these primary resources? Because they're very powerful tools. We're very lucky that we have incredible study tools available to us for step 1. But if not used correctly, there's not infinite amount of time to study for step 1. If done incorrectly, you can study inefficiently and not get to your potential. That's what we want. We want everyone to study to their potential. So most study plans use First Aid and UWorld as these sort of linchpins. First Aid as sort of your content go-to, and UWorld as your question bank. Adding on to that is Dr. Sitar's incredible Pathoma, Sketchy, Boards and Beyond, and things like Board Review series. So I imagine many of you have probably started to write your plan, but if you have not done so, this is a good way to sort of start thinking about what are my primary resources going to be? What are my secondary resources? And there exists more than just these. USMLE RX exists. There's Kaplan. There's Amboss. There's all sorts of good stuff out there. It's just picking a few and then sticking with them, because over-resourcing becomes a problem as well. What did you use for your plan? Anything besides these major ones? Any hidden gems?
So I think honestly, I'm a really big subscriber in the mentality of limiting resource fatigue and just doing, really getting the most out of these tried and true resources. So I used UWorld, I used Pathoma, and I used First Aid. I have a couple things that I'll discuss about first aid and, briefly kind of when I'm talking next, but I did use the Golden videos, and I think that those were like, a little bit helpful. Like sometimes I just feel like I wasn't in the mood to really like study or review something, and I would just like, or if I had a long drive, I would occasionally play them. And I did find that they would help me, it's very similar to pathoma in the sense that it really teaches you like kind of fundamental pathophysiology. So that's like the only like hidden gem that I think I have to offer. But I think the biggest number one tip is that to understand that step one is primarily, testing your ability to understand pathophysiology and physiology. So from the get-go, you always want to make sure you're developing a very strong foundation in that. And that means that, for instance, pathoma, every single time you're really going through those chapters and really understanding the content.
Beautifully said. And I mean, as far as like hidden gems, my favorite is always pharmacology for the medical student, which no one has ever heard of for some reason, and it's incredible. So if you find yourself struggling with pharm, like autonomics, stuff like that, that was always my go-to. So that sort of leads into what we're going to talk about next. Tell us, the role of first aid, because it's pretty controversial how to use it these days now.
Yeah, I would say that first aid, it's really, people say that it's a must-have, but why is it so necessary? I think the really good thing about first aid is a couple things. One is that it really does extensively cover pretty much any topic that you'll see on UWorld. And the way I would describe it is this, is that on the real step one test. And if you, for instance, could take step one with an open book test, I think anybody would say, okay, I would use first aid as the book that I use for my open book test. And I could almost guarantee that every single question, you could find the answer one place or another in first aid. Now, that being said, it is a very, very dense study material, okay? Even with all the mnemonics and all the information, it still can feel like a really difficult read, really dense. I, for instance, could only find that like the max amount of pages of first aid I could really read and really thoroughly understand was about like 20 pages. So the key here is that I don't think it's realistic to expect that you'll be able to finish first aid in like just 2 to 3 weeks. I think it's something you really need to focus on for the long haul, from the beginning of your dedicated study period. And the one thing that I found really, really helpful with first aid was that if you're in a school that does organ systems, and even if not, I think this is still a viable option, is that I would read the correlating organ system with first aid whenever you're covering that. So for instance, if in the beginning of the year, you have a cardiology block and you're learning different parts of you have cardiology pharm, you have cardiology microbiology, you have cardiology pathology, then I would just try to review maybe a week before your test that correlating chapter in UWorld. And what that does for you is it allows that when you now are reviewing first aid, this isn't the first time that you've ever seen this content. And for me, I think that really worked. It's really worked for my students, because once you see first aid, you'll realize what I mean, that it's so dense. But if you have just a little bit of a leg up and you've seen some of the content before, I can guarantee that it'll help things stick better. Now, UWorld is how you apply your first aid knowledge. It is the epitome of high yield material. The beautiful thing about UWorld is not only is it just all high yield, but the things that that USMLE likes to test the most, there is a very strong correlation of that, the amount of questions being found on UWorld with that. So if it really, if you find that they often ask about heart failure, and in a lot of different ways, UWorld is going to have a very high percentage of heart failure questions, so you can really get the ins and outs of that concept. And this is something that you don't want to use UWorld without any foundation or basis of knowledge. So I would say using it during your dedicated study period, you can definitely use it in the beginning, but you want to make sure that you've already been reviewing at least a little bit prior to using UWorld, so you're getting the most out of it. And then the one thing that I find really, really helpful is somehow finding a way to do UWorld twice. And I don't know, I'm curious to see what David thinks about that. But that's something that I really felt very strongly with, was that you have to make sure that you're using UWorld. And so I think the best way to think of it is that UWorld really should be treated like a textbook. You should be reading every single page, every single word, and reading whether you get the answer right, whether you get the answer wrong, but that's how you get the most out of it. And that's how you're really applying the knowledge that you've worked so hard to learn over the past couple of years. But the big thing here is that you want to have a multidisciplinary approach to the way you're studying. You want to be developing and understanding concepts via Pathoma and First Aid, and then you want to be applying them via a very good scheduled UWorld regimen.
I love it. So, and I mean, that's one of those things too. Back in my day, we only really had UWorld as a major thing. You guys are very lucky now to have Amboss, who is really strong competitor to it at this point. And usually, do you do UWorld a second time? Do you do incorrect? So a lot of times it varies depending on the case. I find that if you find yourself remembering what the questions were, I'll tell my students to switch to Amboss instead. But it also depends. How recently have you just done the first UWorld pass as well? Some people, it's been a little while and they don't remember the questions, and a second pass through sort of works for them. I remember when I took it, I would find myself recognizing the pictures, recognizing the words and the questions, and it would sort of spoil it for me. So like I actually used Amboss as my second question bank instead of going through. But I mean, they're very expensive too. So like that's an option as well to try and just to do UWorld again if you don't want to spend a gazillion dollars on question banks. How do we layer these resources together? So I know you're sort of talking about how to effectively use them throughout the year and how to start building your study plan. How do you layer them all so that, like you mentioned, you have a few real good resources, you're not spreading yourself too thin?
Yeah, so like we were talking about earlier, I think this part is definitely flexible, but I'd say that you do want to at least I do think that doing UWorld on random can be very helpful. But in the beginning, I think it's really important to at least, when you're doing that, I think there's two different ways to look at this. Is that if you're studying UWorld outside of a dedicated period, I really do agree that it's very important to at least have an idea of the content. That's how you're going to get the most out of this, you doing UWorld. So that means looking up the chapter on First Aid, kind of going through those concepts, making sure you have an idea of what, they could possibly test about those concepts. And then also kind of throwing in if, for instance, there wasn't something that there's a fundamental concept that you didn't understand, then going into the BRS physiology series or Pathoma, or, creating, if it's more of a random facts, creating an Anki deck. But by the time you take UWorld, you're not going to be perfect and you're still going to get questions wrong, even at the end of your dedicated period. But in order to get the most out of it, you at least want to be in the headspace of, what is this question really asking? What kind of topics are they want me to think about? What sort of, answer choices, what can I see from these answer choices and how should I be thinking? And the only way to do that is to be at least a little bit prepared for those questions from the get-go. So I would say that that's what we mean by layering, is that, in order to get the most out of UWorld, and I think that most would agree that that's what's going to help you really prepare for the exam, you want to have a good foundation, and that's why you want to get a good scope of the idea. And then you can use the UWorld questions and say, okay, if you did really well in that section, maybe this is a strong section. That's going to help you. You're going to keep that in the back of your head and say, okay, maybe this is something when I, get to my dedicated period, or even when I'm in my dedicated period, I can now not focus on as much because I feel pretty good after this UWorld block. On the other hand, if you really struggled on the UWorld block, but despite feeling like you had a strong foundation, then it's time to go back to those kind of layered resources that we're mentioning, like Pathoma and Anki, and see if you can shore up some of your weaknesses and deficiencies. And the beautiful thing about UWorld is I think it's really good at showing you what you're weak in and what you need to kind of, really review.
There's no hiding the weakness from UWorld. It will find it every time. And I mean, that's the beauty of it. I tell people it's not just a question bank. It is a full-scale learning system. And especially as you move from like the beginning to an end of a study plan, that part there, finding weaknesses, is so important, because going through a second pass, that's what you want to find. You don't want to reinvent the wheel. You want to be efficient and say, these are my weaknesses. Here's where here's where I need to improve. and you won't remember everything in UWorld right away. You will not, I promise you, you will not. Like Dr. Sagani said, it is massive. It is a large textbook, and to this day, there are things in it that I don't know, and that's okay. Part of medical school is learning that you will not, there's not an infinite amount of space in your brain. You need to understand how to interpret the things that are important, and then you use your problem-solving skills to get to the rest of the way there. So, especially in the beginning, don't fret if you get a similar question wrong twice. Learn the pattern. If you're getting a specific fact wrong or concept wrong, and this is going to lead us into our UWorld Journal, which very nicely. Take note of it. Notice the pun there. So take note of it so that you can target that weakness later on. And just like mentioned earlier, don't overwhelm yourself with resources. Pick a few good resources. Have your first aid, and that's your nice big thing. But like have the thing, when you get a question wrong, read all the UWorld from it. But like if UWorld isn't enough, where are you going next? Have one or two resources that are going to be your go-to. For me, it was actually Med Bullets, which was, I guess, another diamond in the rough, which I used in lieu of first aid. I didn't use first aid a lot. But, whatever works for you, because if you find yourself going to your class notes or to a large scale textbook, you're going too far into the weeds where there's probably better resources there. Which brings us to our third part. Stay focused on high yield info. If you don't get every single question about the lipopolysaccharidase, glycosidases, diseases, c'est la vie, it's okay. So focus your attention on the stuff that's going to be heavily represented. The way the exam works is it's a ginormous question bank, and it requires a set amount of questions for certain topics, which is why you and everyone else in the room is going to have at least X amount of heart failure questions. Focus on them more than you focus on the small details of genetic or biochem pathways. Know them, know the high yield facts of those genetic or biochem pathways, but those are the, what's it called? Those are the cherries on top of the cake. So, and then keep it simple. I tell my students, I tell them split your days up into 3. Morning session, afternoon session, evening session. Morning session, do and review a block. Go to lunch, go to the gym, relax. Afternoon session, do and review a block. Eat dinner, watch an episode of Netflix, call your mom. And in the evening, do your Anki, do your review, do your UWorld Journal review. You want to get into a nice, simple routine that fits you and that helps you study efficiently, because efficiency is the name of the game. Which leads us to what is a UWorld Journal and what is it not? It is not a second UWorld. You are not attempting to copy pasta UWorld or Amboss or RX. What you want to do is you want to take the material and interpret them into your notebook or your word processor. One of our deans sent us a great article when I was a second year and basically said, I personally think you guys should do your notes in paper, and this study says why. Not that it's a end all be all, but like this is a great study, and it said that when you write stuff down, you can't write as fast as you type. So you are forced to grapple with the material in your brain and turn it into a smaller, shorter, more condensed sentence. And it is that manipulation of the material where the learning exists. When you type, you can type much faster than you can write, so you end up becoming more of a stenographer. And so they did these studies, and they showed greater retention when people wrote stuff down because they were forced to grapple with the material than when they typed. Now, the flip side, as the slide lightly smells, it's a lot easier to search electronically. So yin and yang to a certain degree. But as mentioned below, it is definitely an individual decision. I like to tell people, try it on a notebook first. Make it not work for you. And if it doesn't work, try something else. But I also like the fact that paper gives your eyes a break from the screen. People think about like giving their brain a break, but they never think about giving their eyes a break. So especially like the days before step 1 itself, you're going to be staring intently at this computer screen for 8 hours straight. I tell people, cut your screen time down as you get ready for step 1. Cut your TV time down. Go outside, see natural light, stuff like that. So that is what a UWorld Journal is. It is, yes, you can eat a bagel, Matt. Bagels are delicious. But it is not supposed to be a carbon copy of all the words on UWorld. If you know you're doing it right, if let's say you get a question on heart failure and you think, man, the takeaway is that, patients that are in chronic heart failure, beta blockers reduce remodeling and have a mortality effect. And then you scroll down to the bottom and the educational objectives, that's something similar to that. That's powerful. Try and write the educational objective in your head and on your paper or type them. And then if it matches what it says, you're on the right spot. Whew, big breath. So speaking of organization, my last 4 minutes were like a stream of consciousness. Roshan, please bring us back and tell us about organization. It's a major key.
Yeah. And really quickly, before I discuss that, I did want to mention, go off of 2 things that David mentioned earlier. One was about avoiding resource fatigue. And I actually feel really strongly about the concept of like making sure that you don't have too many resources. And the reason for that is, one, I think that it can be very frustrating at times to be working and, there can be reasons why you think that your current resources just aren't doing the trick. Maybe you've had a stagnation in your practice test scores. Maybe you feel that, it just becomes it's been very difficult to go through the same routine of reviewing the same content. And I do understand that, but I think my answer to that is 2 things. One is that, you kind of just have to trust the process. These are tried and true resources that really, really do work. And like I said, most of us at MST who have had successful step 1 scores can definitely attest that us and our successful students have all followed a similar regimen. And then another quick thing is that, if you were to say that, this resource is not working out for you, I think that's okay. But like David said, he didn't like first aid, so he replaced it with something. He didn't add med bullets to first aid because then it becomes just so overwhelming. And then you're stuck wondering, oh, maybe I should have done, worked more on this resource. And it really just kind of gets you out of focus. So once you have something that works for you, and that's okay if the standard, UWorld First Aid, Pathoma regimen doesn't work for you, but it's important that you stick to a limited amount of resources. And then another quick thing is David was mentioning about the UWorld Journal, about that you really want it to be short and concise. And I think that's exactly kind of, something that is really, really important, because if you're able to kind of write down a few key points, it's a couple things. One is that means you've distilled the information into what's salient and important and what you probably really didn't know, because that's going to allow you to then say, okay, I really didn't understand this. Let me write this down. Now by writing it down, you're trying to reinforce it, and it's going to allow you to come back to it later. But by not adding excessive information, you're just going to make it a little bit easier for you to review. The other thing is that you want it to be pretty easy and pretty short and sweet, so that when you're reviewing it, it doesn't take days to review your UWorld Journal. In a perfect world, regardless of how many questions you get wrong, it shouldn't take more than a couple hours to go through your UWorld Journal, because it should just be sentences. And if you really have been reviewing them, and we're going to discuss kind of how often to review them, it's the couple days before your test where you're going through your high yield notes, it should be really fast, and you're kind of just coming up with the associations on your own. And now back to this slide. So I really, really, once again, would agree with Dave about organization. I'm a paper guy myself, but I had like I think a pretty good approach that worked well for me. In the beginning, I did 2 passive UWorld, and I finished like kind of about half the pass, half to 3/4 of the pass before dedicated. And what I did was, at that time I was writing, because I do subscribe to the belief that writing, for me, pen on paper, that's how I really get information down. And so I used kind of like a notebook dedicated just to my UWorld notes. I'm not as good with the sticky notes and tabs. I wish I was, and I honestly would recommend that you if you can, you do it. It'll help you just feel like more organized. It'll make it easier to review. But make sure that you're spacing out the tabs and you're writing those notes, and you're really, really making sure that, because you're going to be handwriting this, it's going to be even more incentive to make sure that you're really just getting the important information. And then what I did for my second pass was that I used the UWorld note function. So we talk about Word and Google Docs and Excel, and I'm going to discuss that in a second. But the UWorld also has its own note function. And what you can do with that is that you can write in the note section, and then it'll generate a PDF at the end of, whenever you want. So even midway through UWorld, at the end of UWorld. Now, the caveat is that this works really well for when you're kind of when you want to review your notes last minute before, a week before your test. Downloading the PDFs as you go is not a big deal, but it's just a little bit harder to keep organized. So on the other hand, what a lot of people do is they either come up with the Word/Google Doc, where you can create a table of contents and then organize it based on, topic to topic. Excel, I thought, was really good because I just felt like it could be very clean, and you could organize it, and you could make it, different tabs, one tab for question number, if in case, suppose you wrote something down, you distilled the key point, but you're like, I feel like I need to explore this a little bit more. If you noted down the question number, you can easily search that on UWorld and then just go over the question again. You don't want to be doing that too often, but that's definitely something that'll make it easier for you. But the key is just finding out what works well for you. For me, it was started with paper. Then, for the sake of time, doing it electronically definitely saves time. But either way, I still felt like I was benefiting and synthesizing information. I really like the Excel concept, but I know a lot of people who did very well with, organizing Word. Some people like to do OneNote because you can, you have the customizability, especially if you have a tablet. Whatever works for you, try to figure that out, but make sure that you're being very organizing based on section/organ system, and then also making sure that you write down the question number as a reference, so that you can always go back to that later in case there was high yield diagrams, or there was just, a question and answer that you really wanted to read through again.
I like that. I like that last part, especially writing down question numbers. That's not something I did back in the day that probably would have made my studying ever so slightly more efficient. So I wouldn't have had to search, because I just used the flag function, which is, it works. It's just it gets you right to where you need to be if you know that question number. But yeah, agree. Short and sweet. I challenge my students, if they're doing the paper method, your notes for the day should not be more than 1 page front and back, which makes people a little uncomfortable in the beginning because they're used to writing novels and whatnot. But it really, you should not have notes for more than 1 page front and back. So if you do, that's a key that you're either not or triaging your yield correctly, or you're not synthesizing down into a small enough chunks where you're getting the core concept. So yeah, that was always my big thing. 1 page front and back for each day. And, so that, as you flip through, every page is a day. You could always go back and it was short enough that I would tell people to review the days before when you're writing your new day, to, carry over, did you sleep on that concept? That doesn't make more sense now. We'll go through all that. And this is sort of everything we've been talking about. Anything you want to add on, what to include here?
Yeah, and the big thing is that, when you begin to go through UWorld, I think some of you might have started UWorld, some of you might have not seen it before. You'll realize that, there is going to be hopefully a lot of information, that you are familiar with within that question. Things that, you've already come across. And now I would argue that it's still important to review that. That's how you build a foundation. That's how it becomes muscle memory. You improve your speed, you improve your content knowledge. by reading through all the explanations. But now this is the key, is that knowing, it's really important to, as much as it is to know your weaknesses, know what you do know, So even if you think that this is something that's like a little bit complex, but you really think, oh, I do understand the concept, I do get it, that shouldn't really be included in the UWorld Journal. If you think that like it's something that you're almost definitely going to forget, and you think it's high yield, which is probably going to be a little bit rare, then sure, include it. But if you felt like, oh, this is something that I think I have the hang of, but just in case maybe I should add it, I would strongly recommend against that. So that way your UWorld Journal is really filled with facts that you needed to get the question right, and something that you otherwise did not know prior to doing the question. And that allows you to, once again, really make sure that you're only including really high yield information that is going to help you, with your content review, and help develop, those weaknesses that you are, consequently being able to address every time you do questions. Mnemonics, making your own mnemonics can be very helpful. I used to do that pretty often. And also, very often they'll give you like these lists and these basic tables. And sometimes, those tables where it's like kind of just like very good condensed information, I really just thought that like sometimes just transcribing them, drawing it in my own way, that really helps shore things up. So knowing what to put in your UWorld Journal, I think hopefully after hearing us talk, you kind of get the hang of it. But then also just like, adjusting things about what works well for you. For me, diagrams, like, flow diagrams really, really help things stick. And for me, like those little, not very large tables, but small condensed tables, I always used to kind of just like write them down. And then making sure that you're trying to stay as high yield as possible.
I love it. So I mean, starting to beat this horse now. The important do's and don'ts. Be brief. Keep it high yield. So and sort of like following the Anki method. Work to commit what you've learned. When you feel something sort of slipping away, then is a good time to what's it called, to sort of review it. And like we said, don't copy whole paragraphs. Don't write and never use it. And for some of us who have particularly poor handwriting, like myself, I would have pages though, like, well, I'm sure there was something important there, but I never quite got it. So be careful too if you have bad handwriting. Either type or go slow, or come up with shorthand, like Russian mentioned. And then the same thing. If you're reviewing a question, it should not exceed 2 or 3 sentences. So an example here: 67-year-old man presents to your office with crushing chest pain radiating to left arm. I'm not sure how they got troponins in the office, but EKG shows elevations in 2, 3 in foot. What is the most likely area of damage? Nailed it, Matt. It is indeed C, the inferior myocardium. So if you did not know that the 2, 3 in foot corresponded to the inferior surface of the heart, that would be your UWorld Journal entry. What area of the heart is associated with 2, 3 in foot? And a lot of times I tell people, because you're going to see this question a couple different times. It's not going to be one and done for something as high yield like this. So if the first time you wrote in your journal, the 2, 3 in foot correspond to the inferior wall of the heart, and the next time you get it right, and that, take it a step further. So, 2, 3 in foot correspond to the inferior wall of the heart, which supplies the right ventricle, which is preload dependent, which is why you don't give nitro and you do give fluids. Look at that. That may be the second or third time you see a question inferior wall. And now that sentence is jam-packed with review and news, so that every time you see it, you're piling on, just like that last slide mentioned, you are putting together, you're building a big brick wall with every brick is the little bit of knowledge that you had from before. So we have some additional examples here. Give us let's take a look at these.
Yeah, so I mentioned I kind of really like the flow diagrams of like kind of with the arrows, and I think the reason for that is that and this is kind of the reason why I really like pathoma and pathophysiology is that if you really understand something, you fundamentally get the concept, then suppose that you need to know A, B, and C. If as long as you fully understand A and fully understand C, you can often get to B. If I knew that a carotid massage increases my parasympathetic activity and decreases my sympathetic activity, and I know what the underlying mechanisms of, what affects parasympathetics versus sympathetics are, then, even if I don't exactly remember the mechanism, if I look at the answer choices and, something mentions the baroreceptors, okay, I know that, okay, the baroreceptors are stretch-like receptors responding to the amount of pressure on them. That's going to cause increased firing and then affect activity. So, even if I didn't fully know this like kind of chain, as long as I knew, the direction of, how this flow diagram is going, I can understand the concept and then, probably get the answer right. So that's why I found that like, doing these types of relationships where it's like, if A, then B, then C, not only is it just helping you review the idea, but and the specific organ system or like concept that's being discussed, but it also just helps you, in case you forget, you at least have a logical approach to things. This, on the other hand, is another one of my favorites. It's just like a very simple but high yield table. You often will see, something will be presented in terms of like, they'll give you the hyperbilirubinemia, and then they'll split it up into like, if the urine bilirubin is increased, the urine urobilinogen is increased. They'll, maybe give you direct versus indirect. The extent of that, maybe they'll tell it to you directly. Maybe they'll mention like, hemolysis labs are increased, but they'll give you, a clue. And then as long as you understand that relationship, then, you'll get the question right. But these tables can really just help you organize things. So we know that, with hepatic injury, depending on, the type of injury, you can either get a direct or indirect hyperbilirubinemia. But we are going to always have increased urine bilirubin, and you're going to have decreased or normal urine urobilinogen. And then the cool thing is, like, for instance, with hemolysis, right? I know that I'm going to have increased urobilinogen, as the byproduct. And so even if I don't fully understand, what, am I going to have an indirect hyperbilirubinemia? Yes, because, it's not the, reuptake that's being affected. It's more the, it's a byproduct of the hemolysis. But even if I didn't remember that, if I know that urine urobilinogen is the only way I'll have an increased value, that is the only way that happens is with hemolysis, I can get the other two values as well. So finding out what makes like, a specific, type of, answer choice unique, and these tables can really help with that, can also really guide you when you're, not only with UWorld, but obviously when you're on the real exam, kind of distilling, what is actually the most important facts I'm getting from the question, what facts should I be looking for, and how do I use like kind of this table that I kind of have a mental image of to help me answer the question.
Oh, hold on. Kitten alert. So, Bear Bear says hello. That was great. And kudos, man. 2 years of optho, and you remember urobilinogen in the urine. I haven't used that word in a long time.
Honestly, neither have I, and hopefully I don't have to.
So here's a bad example. So tell us about this one.
Yeah, so this is kind of the example of where, there is information here, and, some is definitely high yield, but, there's 2 issues with this. Some of it, I think, is that, there is kind of non-high yield facts here, and it's just going to take long to either transcribe this or type this. And then it's, it's kind of, you have to think of it as like kind of a double investment. You're investing the time to actually, write down the information, but you're also investing the time to review it later on. So they're talking about like kind of hepatitis A clinical course, and they're presenting as more a paragraph, but a simple kind of like flow diagram would have easily accomplished the same thing. So what is really high yield here? One, it's that hepatitis A is, compared to other hepatitis, is oral fecal transmission. Okay, that's a distinct high yield thing compared to hepatitis B or C. Okay, so that's something I know. It's it can present in these developing countries, but how important is it to know that? I'm not as sure about, that, but in the sense that like hepatitis A, the key facts for me are that it's oral fecal transmission. It is in developing countries, not as common in the U.S. But do I need to know that it's, presenting like in that presentation with children? Probably not as much, okay, versus adults. I kind of need to know how it's transmitted, how it's going to present. It's like kind of more of a GI infection, okay? It's generally self-limited. That's also important because a lot of times they'll ask you, what is the sequelae of potentially getting this, hepatitis A or hepatitis C? What do I have to worry about? Okay, is this something I have to worry about with hepatitis A? Or on the flip side, if a patient has cirrhosis and they ask me, oh, what are some, potential risk factors that could have initiated this? And they talk about, shared needle usage, and they talk about blood transfusions. And then maybe they mentioned that, travel abroad into, another region. I need to know that hepatitis A would not be the answer there because it's not likely to cause cirrhosis. So that's another key thing, self-limiting. Now, IgG versus IgM, that's much more common, if we recall, with like kind of hepatitis B, because that, I've seen enough questions with that. We know how they like to test about core antigen, core antibody with the vaccine for hepatitis B. So obviously the more you do, the more you'll kind of get an idea of what is high yield and what isn't. But you really want to make sure that you can condense the information to what's really important. I'll be a little bit quicker with the bottom one, with carnitine deficiency. They're asking, there are certain enzymes, okay, that are involved in the reaction. Those may or may not be important, but the big thing is that I'm going to have decreased levels of acetyl-CoA, okay, and the downstream products of that. And then I need to know what the presentation is, in my opinion. So I need to know what is the missing enzyme, okay? I need to know what is the result of that missing enzyme, and then I need to know some common symptoms that might be tested on, okay? And so that's kind of what I would be, if I saw a question about carnitine deficiency, I want to think about like, what did I really need to know from this whole explanation to get the answer right? And that's something that always should be included in your high yield fact, is that, what from this answer choice is, the information that makes the right answer to the question. So yeah, that should be included. But if there's a lot of excess information, that's probably not necessary. So we're going to go over to the next slide and see kind of some better examples of how to discuss these, two topics. So for hepatitis A, like we mentioned, oral fecal, I don't even know, I don't even need to write transmission. I know that, okay, this is what as long as I'm in the mode of thinking how to organize these things, maybe this is hepatitis, I'm thinking of is more bacterial, so I will be thinking about transmission. Okay, so I simply say oral fecal, self-limiting. That's important, right? Because I said, I don't see that this is going to lead to cirrhosis or chronic liver disease. It's acute only, so it's not like something that, hang around. It's often developing countries. So if they mention like international travel with a GI infection, that's something I'm thinking about. But this is something that clearly would have taken me a couple seconds to write, a couple seconds to review. But I don't think I really lost that much reviewing this example compared to the previous example. Similarly, so carnitine deficiency, we're going to have decreased levels of acetyl-CoA. And that's kind of what we mentioned. Could you be tested on the enzyme? Sure. Is it worth committing that to memory when it's probably, the grand scheme of things, pretty low? Probably unlikely. Okay. And, what kind of symptoms am I looking for? I'm looking for weakness after exercise, increased muscle triglycerides, myoglobinemia. Okay. Those are the ways that, and part of it is kind of, once you get in the mode of doing UWorld and you see some answer choices, one thing I used to like to do is, okay, this answer choice was wrong, but what question would this answer choice be the right answer to, And so, if, for instance, carnitine deficiency, that was an incorrect answer choice, then I would think to myself, like, okay, how would they present this? How would they kind of try to frame a question based on the question I'm seeing now? And that I thought was also very helpful because it gets you the idea of, a test-taking mentality, and also just helps you kind of distill what's probably really important about these individual topics.
No, that's really good too, and especially since a lot of the UWorld, a lot of the questions on the exam, the principal distractor, a lot of the answer choices that are wrong are written to be similar to your correct answer. So like trying to figure out, what would I change about this question in order to get to this other place is very important. And every question you do, even the ones you get right, you should say to yourself, how did I differentiate this from the principal distractor? Usually the principal distractor is the wrong answer picked most often. So like if it's 60% right, the wrong answer people picked 25% right, that's usually the hair they're trying to split between what made this question point there towards the other one. Mm-hmm. So when to review your journal, try and aim for at least 1 hour per week. It's a little bit, you can do it a couple different ways. I usually tell people to try and make sort of the system that I teach my students is 1 page front and back every day. And then in the evening of the next day, take 5 minutes and review yesterday's page. Do I understand all the major things in that page? If not, copy them forward, review them, use a different resource if you have to. If it's just not sticking, see it from a different point of view, and then copy it forward to the next day. And if you understand something about it and something else comes up, write it in different words so that you're grappling with the material in your head, so that, again, you're building, every brick is building that wall. So, and again, there's many different ways to do it. You can do it all at once every week. I recommend 5 to 7 minutes every weeknight. And then in the last few days, try and, flip through your book and see, I had a lot of trouble with this, but I don't have trouble with that anymore. I don't need to do anything about it. Or I forgot about this. I'm not good at that. Let me target 15 to 20 minutes to filling in this particular gap. So there's many different ways to do it. Again, pick one that works for you. I recommend the copy forward method, where you do a page every day and you review the previous page. And if you're really bad at a topic, you may end up writing about it for 3 or 4 days straight, but every day you should understand a little bit more, and your ability to write it should be increased every time. And then, cover up the answers. Your first word or two should tell you enough that you should be able to synthesize your head what the rest is. Like that hepatitis A one, if it's in there, if you see the words hepatitis A, try not to look at the rest. Say, okay, it's fecal oral, developing countries, self-limited, doesn't really cause cirrhosis. And then look down and say, okay, I've got those major things. Oh, I forgot X, Y, and Z, the type of RNA, DNA virus it is. And then, if you forget something, you don't have to write the stuff you knew before. You would just copy forward what type of virus it is, because that's the only thing you have left to learn new in hepatitis A. And then if you get it wrong, review it, highlight it, and then sort of rinse and repeat all the way through. And it doesn't sound that hard, because it's not supposed to be that hard. It's supposed to be simple and easy to reproduce, so that you can do it every day and get good at it and be able to find your weaknesses, fill in your weaknesses, find your weaknesses, fill in your weaknesses. So sort of starting to wrap up a little bit now, how do we use UWorld effectively? A lot of this is stuff we talked about already, so this is a nice little summary.
Yeah, so I would say like the biggest thing that you really want to take away is that UWorld, it is a learning tool. Sure, it's very good to get an idea of using UWorld to say, where am I at my progress? How am I doing percentage-wise on my blogs? And where have I noticed an improvement? And that's great. But UWorld is primarily used as a way to reinforce and learn new information. It really is its own version of a textbook, based in like kind of a question bank form, and probably one of like I really don't think I'm understanding this. Probably one of the best question banks, like kind of out of any question bank that exists, because of how well it just kind of explains concepts and reviews these ideas. Couple things about kind of doing incorrects. I think that in general, most people will agree that, doing well in step one is kind of not just knowing a certain amount of content, but the people who do really well are the ones who say, okay, I'm weak in these areas, I need to address them. And I think a lot of times is that people like, they just like decide, I'm just not good at, like, for instance, nephrology. I'm just kind of going to, phone that section in and say, hope that I don't get them any questions. And that's just like not the right mentality to have, because you don't want to have like kind of this magical setup for your test in order for you to do well. You want it to be that the test is, no matter what type of test you get, you feel as prepared as possible. And so that's where, for instance, doing incorrect questions can really help, because what that allows you to do is it allows you to address your weaknesses and distinctly kind of, if you got a question wrong in the first place, there's probably a couple different reasons why you might have. Either it's a lack of content review, either it's a time thing. But either way, by doing the incorrect question, seeing it again, you can reevaluate, did I review this, content properly? Did I fully understand this topic? Or is this something that I still need to work on? And if you got the question wrong again, then that's a wake-up call that maybe kind of we talked about earlier about the layering resources. Maybe you need to, shore this up with maybe a YouTube video or reading a specific chapter in a book. It's you yourself want to use UWorld as a step one textbook, but you don't want to be writing one. I really actually, I think I might adopt David's rule about kind of a single page front and back, because it really forces you to actually see what's important, what's like really, you actually need to get from this. Because if you spend so much time writing all these notes, one, will you even have time to review those notes? And two, you're probably taking away from your ability to do further questions, which would help you identify further weaknesses, which is ultimately how you're going to do well on the test. If you want to do flashcards, I know a lot of people who swear by flashcards. They're, Anki people who like to write their flashcards. You want to make sure that the whole point of the flashcards is for kind of a rapid synthesis of information. So you want to have one key takeaway. If you have, and that's how you really kind of make those associations, which will help you on test day. If you have a lot of information bogging down these flashcards, you're not going to get the most out of them, because you're going to be so, worried about missing one specific point out of 4 on the flashcard that you're not really sure if you need to come back and review this again. And then the notebook, like we mentioned, the notes function I really, really liked. I thought they did a very good job of generating it into a PDF. They have the question, correlating question number right there for you. They organize it by organ system. Doing an Excel sheet, if you kind of want to work your way through it and you think it'd be a little bit easier for review, that's also definitely something to do. But out of everything, the number one thing about our UWorld notebook that I think we'll all agree on is that you need to stay organized. You need to organize it based on how you think is best. I would say based on organ system. And, you could even split it up into maybe within the organ system into pharmacology versus microbiology, et cetera. But figure out a way to organize it so that if you ever want to go back to your UWorld journal and review a specific topic, you can easily do that.
And now a moment, I know one of our attendees here asked us about step 2. Not a lot of differences. What are the little minute differences between step 1 and step 2?
Yeah, so I would say in step 2, doing UWorld once, I think is definitely more adequate. There's a couple more resources. And I think because of the way the shelf exams are, some people have their shelf exams all the way at the end, some have them throughout the year, but you're allowing yourself to kind of reinforce that material, and it's a little bit more fresher. It's not 2 years of information being synthesized. It's more building on the foundation that you already had with step 1, along with some clinical correlates. So that I think will help make your UWorld journal probably a little bit less bogged down, because more of it, I think step 2 is understanding like kind of whole concepts and logical pathophysiology. So the UWorld journal in this instance, I think the only difference is you want to have a similar approach, be very direct, be very deliberate with the skill set, but you will, I would say that in these instances, if you're really struggling on understanding a concept, in step 2 versus step 1, step 2, I'd say there's a couple more resources that you can explore. And, you may want to make sure that rather than coming back to it later and saying, okay, I'm going to review this down the line, that because you're working within, like, for instance, pediatrics versus OBGYN, not only for your shelf, but also just to make sure that you're not having like a bunch of like, various sources of like kind of parts that you need to understand, that you really try to address it early if you find that there's a deficiency that you've noticed. And, tables, and, using these reviews. But overall, I would say Your step 2 CK UWorld Journal will be very similar to your step 1. And I don't know if David has anything else you want us to add.
No, very, very similar. I still use a sort of front and back, try and concise it down, try and compare it to your educational objective. A lot of people, you know, when I was going through clinicals, we did UWorld throughout the year, and then we used Amboss for CK. And you know, it's very similar. Your Amboss journal looks very similar to your UWorld journal. You know, the one difference I have is, you know, algorithms. You can draw more algorithms in CK. These if then else sort of things. You know, if chest pain plus troponin are negative, because it's kind of similar to the way that the online med-ed notes work. What's it called? And sometimes I will tell people, you know, try and keep them into like try and put a box and then put your algorithm in there, because that is a lot more powerful if you can work your way through them. What's it called? You know, because you can quickly review those later. And now actually we get to our question and answer. We've got our first question from Matt, who asks, can we annotate first aid in place of UWorld Journal? Does it matter? Now, some people are first aid annotate swearers. And if it works for you, by all means, there's nothing wrong with it. I've seen people do it and not do the individual journal outside of it. My best advice is that if you're going to do that, make sure that you're incorporating reviews of first aid serially, because the one thing about the notebook that you don't get if you're just annotating first aid is that, you know, you're all over the place. Like, you're not going day by day, page by page. So if you're doing systems-based paths, you can get away with it, because you can do all the UWorld questions and cards, annotate all of cards, and then at the very end of that, review all your cards and do it all at once. That, I think, is a pathway that would sort of work. What do you think?
Yeah, so I would 100% agree that it's a little bit tricky, because if you're annotating UWorld, you know, the big thing about the UWorld journal is that you are reviewing it weekly. At least, you know, that's how you're going to get the most out of it, because, you know, if you annotate something and then, like, you know, or come across 3 months later, you may not have the same knowledge that you had 3 months, you know, going forward. You may not understand the headspace you were in when you first annotated that. Instead, if it's a week later, it's fresh. That's how you really learn information, by kind of really repeatedly drilling it in, keep, you know, solidifying and reinforcing the information. So the only time that I would say is, you know, a time when obviously it is very, very something preference, but I would say annotating UWorld is something that you really want to do before your dedicated period, because in your dedicated period, you know, it becomes one. I think it is a pretty time intensive process. It can be really, really helpful, but it can definitely take a lot of time. And two is that, kind of like David said, is that you don't want to like have annotate something week 1 and then come across it again like week 5. Even though, you know, even though it's a matter of a month, you're right. It's like, you know, suppose you have a 6-week dedicated period that's right before your test day. How do you know that you're going to really reinforce that information? So annotating, you can't go wrong, but I would say it's definitely something you want to do earlier rather than later. And then there's another question that kind of goes along that earlier rather than later, is that doing kind of the order of question banks. I think the general consensus is saving UWorld either for, you know, right before your dedicated period, getting it started, and then continuing into your dedicated period. But that's what you want to be seeing the most of during your dedicated period, because that's like the most high yield, you know, most likely testable information. Doing USMLE RX and Amboss, there's no problem with that. You know, you can, especially in the beginning of the year, you can get more exposure to questions. If you find that you're someone who learns the most with questions, by all means, I would recommend it. But now the key here is that you don't use this in lieu of UWorld, and you're making sure that, you know, when it comes to your dedicated period, unless you're able to do an absurd amount of questions a day, which, you know, even 200 plus, I think is pretty rare to find people who can comfortably do that. you're probably only want to be doing UWorld, a month to a couple months before your actual exam.
No, I agree. So I loved RX to do throughout the year because I didn't, like I mentioned before, I very seldomly used, yeah, exactly, mimics first aid. I very seldomly used first aid on its own. So doing RX throughout the year was my pass through first aid. And then as I was going back, I would use first aid very sparingly, just to look at pictures and whatnot. But like, because I went through RX first, I had my passive of first aid and got a question bank done at the same time. Then I did UWorld, which is the big mamma jamma, as we all know. And then here's my one spicy thing for the evening. I usually recommend AMBOSS after UWorld because I find AMBOSS to be harder. And I find that a lot of times AMBOSS is too hard for people who haven't done UWorld yet. Especially some of those 3-4 hammer questions. The 5 hammer ones, lol. No one gets those right. But like the test is really those 3 and 4 hammer questions. And they're really good. I just find that if that's your first exposure after like RX, that it's a little too hard. What's it called? And we have another question. Matt bringing us lots of good stuff. Can you use Anki like a red flag? Now, if I had another hour, I'd talk about how to use Anki during dedicated because most people use it incorrectly. They think they're going to get through these mega decks in the middle of their 6-week plan. Kind of like a red flag thing. I usually tell people have 2 decks for Anki for step 1 or CK, whatever. One deck is your high yield association deck. Find your favorite mega deck and pull out all the HLAs, your rate limiting enzymes, your stuff, your gene number and gene names, the stuff that is rote memorization that is going to get you free points. Why is von Hippel-Lindau on gene 3? Beats me, but there was a flashcard once and I remember it 5 years later. So there's your first deck, high yield association nonsense. It should only be 300 or 400 questions. You should have them down cold in 3 or 4 weeks. Your other one is sort of what you're asking about, Matt, your red flag deck. If you find, and this is why I love the copy forward paper approach, if you find that you have to copy something forward twice, as in you're reviewing it 3 days in a row, then it should become a flashcard, in my opinion. It doesn't need to be this big whole thing. It doesn't need to stay there forever. I highly recommend people delete flashcards or at least suspend flashcards after they get them right 5 or 6 times in a row. But like if you find yourself having to copy forward a concept, that is a good idea to make it an Anki card, which is a whole nother topic in itself, how to write good Anki cards. Thoughts?
So I'll be honest, I was sort of, I guess, like the minority of someone who didn't really love Anki. I felt like what really worked well for me was kind of reading through explanations, and that's how I kind of solidified concepts. And I just found that setting a dedicated time to make the decks or use someone else's decks and then review them, it just seemed like such an intensive process. But I can tell you that I know in my day, my classmate Anki experts, my coworker Anki experts, and let me tell you, it does work for the right people. The key, and this is I think the only thing I can add, is that figure out, I would say early, if you are someone who likes flashcards or likes Anki. If you are, then you really want to have a good system, and I think Dave really offered up a good system because I'm thinking about it, and I was like, oh, that's something that could have worked. And I think that a lot of times, and this might have happened to me, is that people get bogged down and they say, this is one way to do, approach doing flashcards or one way to approach reviewing UWorld, and it doesn't work for you, and then you kind of just give up. And I say that that's something where at MST we can, maybe help you out a little bit and say, hey, listen, if this technique didn't work, how about this? And we have a couple things in our arsenal that say, this might not have, my technique might not have worked out for you. Let me reach out to some of my colleagues, see if they have any insight to offer. And maybe they do. And then, you let me know you're a flashcard person. I reach out to Dave, and then, you try this method. But everything is, I think we both got a good level of success on step one. And I think a lot of that was that me and Dave, we probably both figured out what worked well for us. And we really tried to maximize that and highlight that. And we took that home. And, for instance, I'm not exactly a flashcard person. I'm a big questions guy. I don't mind. I didn't mind doing UWorld twice. I'd like to do when I was studying for my med school exam, my med school question bank. I tried to do as many questions as I can because I found that was a lot more enjoyable for me than just kind of rote memorization reading. So find your strengths, maximize the strengths, and I'm very sure you'll find some success.
That's a great point too. Is we took two very different ways to get to the same place, and both of us had some real heretic ways of doing it. I pretty much ignored first aid. You pretty much ignored Anki, and it's one of those things too. The best practices are there for you to build a framework, and then this is why I recommend, this is why I recommend so heavily to people who are not in dedicated to start thinking about dedicated and trying different things at a low level during your course exams. Because one, if you're going to be an Anki person, Anki is most helpful before dedicated. And, you get the chance to try, trial and error. You get the chance to try different things and see if they work. And then by the time you're about to do dedicated, have a decent framework that still may change throughout the way through, but will get you there and fits your attention span or, your habits. For me, I'm a very low-tech person. So again, most of my things, if it wasn't a question or Anki, it was on paper. Or if you're someone who reads a lot, or if you're doing CK, for example, there are two people in this world, people who love Step Up the Medicine, and people who hate Step Up the Medicine. So, and it's one of those things. And, our job here is to give you this big toolbox and say, look what we have. I think this might work for you. And put a couple things together, and if it does, great. If it's not, here's what also exists, because there's a cornucopia of goodness up in here. So a little bit real quick, and we'll sort of wrap up. Again, what we do is, if you cannot tell, is we offer everything from alpha to, is Zeta a thing? I don't know. From pre-med to residency and beyond. We write schedules, we do content, we do study plans, stuff like that, accountability. I keep in touch with a lot of my former students. It's always fun to watch them do well, to fly away, to be like butterflies. So if you've got a problem that has something to do with medicine, I'm sure we could probably come up with something to help you. So is there any other questions? We'll hang for another 90 seconds if there's no questions. Otherwise, this has been super helpful. Let us know in the chat. Did you guys enjoy this? Did you find it helpful? What would you change? Would you tell me to be quiet more often? Stuff like that. Are the jokes not landing? Other than that, any parting thoughts?
No, I just wanted to wish you guys, good luck. It is a stressful process. Don't get me wrong. Not even just dedicated period, but even before that. And, I think a couple parting thoughts would be, one, your step score doesn't define you. Whatever you get on step one, even if you find that, you had dreams of a certain specialty, and unfortunately your step one score hasn't allowed you to do that. At the end of the day, the most important thing is that whatever field you land in, I'm sure you'll be able to find something that within that field that you're passionate about and something that interests you. And if you do get that dream score that you wanted, it's nice to know that kind of, your hard work really, it's nice to see a reward for your hard work. But the big thing that I think is, is something that my dad kind of reminded me of this when I was studying, is that it's really important to really just take pride in the fact of how hard you're working, especially during the dedicated period. It's a lot of work and you feel like you're not taking a break, but very few people really challenge themselves to their utmost potential. And if you really find that, you know, you're working hard. I really think it's important to take a lot of pride in that, and use that pride and use that determination to guide you for the rest of your, you know, medical school experience and your career, and hopefully carry that forward, even, you know, years after you're practicing.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of these, so if I have to give one last piece of advice, don't think like you're mentioning, step one is not the end all be all. It's really not. And I feel like med schools do a poor job of telling people that, like, the apex of your stress level is not step one. It's really third year. So like, if you find that you're struggling, you're not hitting your goal scores, step back. If I could give one big piece of advice to everyone that's coming up as like a second year, is make sure you're ready to take that next step. No pun intended. If it's step one, if it's year three, you know, make sure your mental health is all put together, because it only gets harder as you move into third year too. So like, you want to make sure you have your foundation. If you need extra time for stuff, if you need to take time off, every person I've ever met who took time off was happy they did at the end. And then, yeah, like you were saying, you know, you build great study habits to be proud of, study habits that will lead you into residency and into practice. I still do Anki as a third year resident. So it may only be 20, 30 questions a day. And it may be super silly minutia, like what's the color of the different lab tubes and the additives and which ones do I use? That'll never be tested ever again, but it's sort of the stuff that helps move my day faster. And just having those the study skills from step one and step two will allow you to get information quicker, you know, because I use that now. I have one major reference. It's called Wickham, and for a lot of my ER questions that I have to look up real quick. And then I have one or two major secondary references. And again, all of those were skills based off of step one, where I had med bullets. Now, ortho bullets also exists, and it is awesome. But like, I have my couple resources that I use for everything as I'm seeing all my patients in the ER. So think about how you're going to use these skills, because this is a great opportunity for you to get ahead of the game long term. All right, it's been a pleasure. Wishing everyone health, wealth, all the good stuff in the world.
Good luck, everybody.
See y'all later.